today, we're looking, as I say, it's such a wide subject, but we try to bring down to the ingredients of what makes a cultural destination a success. What is a cultural destination? And the mechanisms and the drivers, that make things happen. And what can we look forward to in the future, basically. Before introducing our panels, I'm just going to take a moment to give two examples that are kind of on the opposite end of a spectrum. And it's Bilbao and Miami. More than Bilbao, actually, it's the Basque region, and Miami, just Miami, not Florida.
Why not?
So Bilbao, we've been talking about this for so long, and it's been such a landmark, of course, as a piece of architecture and as a piece of rejuvenation of a city. But as of today, 2017, and recently, this is the museum, but we have now another extension of this site that's just happened. And what's interesting in Bilbao is the link between this particular project and the city and the region and the culture. So we were looking at the timeline of what happens, and we realized that things were kind of stirring up in the Basque region before the government and the city commissioned the Guggenheim Museum. And after that, you can see it triggers a series of initiatives, the tram, the park, the museum, and now the completion of a master plan with the Abandoibara district. So it's such a primary example of one very strong, iconic destination that trigger a wave effect. Wow, just hit by the waves. But what's interesting to us also is what is the context that nurture and that get people to go there. It's beyond the museum and beyond all these things. And we know that maybe you don't know, but the Basque cuisine, the food is, and in the last 5 years has been such talked about, and it's on the forefront of the culinary experimentation, and people just go there also to the Basque Country to have this experience. Just to tell you this, I think in San Sebastian city only, which is close to Bilbao, there's 16 Michelin star restaurants in one city, in a country, in a region that was thought not that long ago as not that interesting to visit. Mm-hmm. So I think what we're trying to say is that what are the correlation? What is the influence of the context that is already there, and how can it sustain, right? A big project like a high culture such as the museum, the Bilbao Museum. So looking back on the other side of the ocean, in Miami, it's a completely different situation. As you know, Miami was probably deemed as a cultural wasteland in the 80s and 90s. A lot of problems with drugs and things like that. But then something happened, and again, you can see a timeline of decision makings, and with Art Basel in 2002 moving there, and then triggering a series of initiatives. But interestingly, in the US, it's more private initiatives rather than government-led, of course with the support of the mayor and the city, but it's two different mindsets, basically, with such thing as the Wynwood Art District, very recently the very iconic Lincoln car park by Herzog and de Meuron, things like that. So looking at two different contexts, but still, I think everybody, maybe you've seen that movie, The Chef by Jean Favreau, and the Cuban sandwich, and this Miami culture that is kind of at the lower hand, if you look at food, compared to what Bilbao and the Basque region is. It's really the 3-star Michelin. And in Miami, it's this culture of street food and very exotic cuisine, basically. But still, it's two kind of cultural context that feeds a city to become a very unique destination with such a strong identity. So I think just to set up the conversation, we want to look at the ingredients and the process that drives those cultural destinations. So we are very lucky, and Marc is going to today to have a distinguished panel. Marc, who's going to introduce
starting from the bottom.
Alexandra.
Ladies first. Alexandra Seno. She's heading the development of Asia Art Archive. She's been writing for numerous different magazines and serious publication, done research, and she's in touch with a lot of people that are developing culture in Hong Kong. Timothy Calnin.
Si tu veux.
We have a French touch. Has been involved with the Hong Kong Opera, Philharmonic, sorry, and then the Sydney Opera. And now he just joined the Kwun team into managing the operation of Kwun. He's an extended know-how not only in music and all that, but also on sponsorship and how to activate these venues. And finally, Michael Moir, who is more on the property side, I will say, and at the very early stage where he goes and he shakes the board between the architect and the people who pays. So we have these three fantastic persons here, and we hope we can talk everything about culture, so from food to music, and especially try to figure out, because we all want to go out here with knowing how we create a cultural destination.
Right. The magic recipe. So our first question is really to the three members of our panel. One question for three of them, and hopefully three different type of answer. So in your opinion, what is the single most ingredient in creating cultural destinations that are both relevant and sustainable? Alexandra, please.
I think it's how you listen to what's already existing. So listening to the creative communities, listening to what people want, listening to what people need. It's interesting that you've used Bilbao as a jumping off point. I looked. I'm also interested in urban planning and how the question of whether or not culture can be, if you can create cultural destinations, right? And I wrote something in 2004. I thank you, Google. That looked at the so-called Guggenheim effect.
Yeah.
So
the way
when Guggenheim first opened in Bilbao in 1997, in the 7 years from then to 2004, when I wrote this piece, a consultant had figured out that it had added something like $1 billion to the local economy, because that's Rust Belt area of Spain, right?
Yep.
And people have taken this idea and run with it. I don't know if you remember, but there were actually 4 live Guggenheim in Asia projects. There was Taichung, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Macau at some point, and we have none of those. In most cases, it was really the expense of so-called franchising these places. So when they were looking at Taichung, which is when I looked at the so-called Guggenheim effect, Taichung had just said no thank you to Guggenheim because the price tag was something like 250 million US dollars, which
was the price tag of Bilbao.
Bilbao was 100 million to build.
Okay.
And then there's everything else. So it's really a question, I think, of can you say, does the Field of Dreams, can you do, if you build it, will they come? I mean, I don't think so, unless there's something organic. So I think it's really about listening.
Okay, listening. First ingredient. Michael.
Well, as I mentioned earlier on, my background has always been in engineering, construction and property development, but I was very fortunate to meet my lovely wife Anne, who's here, when we were both students, and she was an artist. And so we started going and visiting cultural destinations, probably initially more in Europe, but then we moved to Asia. And I would go and look at the buildings and Anne would go and look at the content. But it's almost like sometimes that's reversed, where she goes now and looks at buildings and I go and look more at the content. But to me, the success of a cultural destination is the marriage of the two. You know, you have to have a building or a collection of buildings or an urban environment that makes you feel good. You want to go there and you want to feel good. And you also, for it to be sustainable and to make you go back again, you want to feel you've learnt something. And I guess Sydney Opera House is a great example. We go to Australia a lot, and we go to events in the Sydney Opera House virtually every time we go there. So I think to me it's this combination of the two factors.
Right. Timothy.
Well, the Opera House is an interesting example because it's sort of, now that I don't work there anymore, I can speak a little bit more openly. It's a bunch of really terrible venues inside a fabulous piece of sculpture. And so I think the trick to make it successful has been, of course, the big thing that the Opera House gets really hung up on is the fact that it attracts, I think, 8.2 million visitors to the outside every year, but really just a fraction of that number to the inside. That's not to say that the performances aren't tremendously well attended, they are. But there's always this obsession about how do we convert all of those people who come and take a photograph on the forecourt into people who actually experience what the Opera House was built for. And that's an ongoing challenge, and it should be an ongoing challenge. I think one of the things that I remember talking to my chief executive at the Opera House when I was the director of performing arts, and I said to her, you know, really what I would like to try and achieve from a programming point of view is a range of annual programs that are so diverse and interesting and exciting and stimulating that people would come regardless of whether it was in the Opera House or, you know, if you imagine what was there before the Opera House, it was a tram shed. So I told her about my whole kind of tram shed mentality, how, you know, we need to come up with a program that would attract as many people to a tram shed as it did to the Opera House. That didn't really get much of a flicker of recognition from Louise, so that wasn't such a good analogy. I wanted to come back to Alex's point about this sort of the need for
Listening.
Listening and being organic and really developing something that really belongs and grows out of the place. And of course that only comes by listening to what people need and expect. I think that really essentially the ingredient that will create a successful cultural precinct or cultural destination is creativity being at the heart of it, rather than, you know, I think we all have lived in major cities, and Hong Kong is certainly one of them, where if you sit in Hong Kong for a period of 12 months, you'll be offered an incredible range of touring international stuff, which doesn't really make Hong Kong distinctive. What makes it distinctive is something that has really grown organically from the cultural ecology of this space that makes it distinctive and unique. And I think that's really the essential ingredient.
Yeah, I think that's why we choose this example of Bilbao and the Basque region and Miami, because it's almost counterintuitive, but then when you dig into it, you realize that the context and the organic context is very important too, because you see some icons, but you don't necessarily realize that you need a soil that is fertile enough to, you know, to nurture and to make those things grow and sustain. All right, so maybe we're gonna get into, you know, more questions. I think our next question for Alessandra, I think, and it's I took this example of again maybe a bit counterintuitive of Lisbon in Portugal. Which I think is an amazing city. I've been there maybe last year. I'm going back this summer with the family. And we're going to spend a week there. And it's what I thought amazing in Lisbon, which by the way is becoming a hot touristic destination, but also cultural destination in many ways. and just been ramping up in the last 5 years. And I had this experience, which is a food market with so it's in a converted heritage hall, basically, which used to be a food market, basically. And there's several halls, and the other halls are still used as a fresh market for vegetable, fish, meat. And the last one has been converted as a marketplace for restaurants, and curated by Time Out. Mm-hmm. But all the restaurants are all around, and they are basically the like pop-up stores from some of the most creative, best restaurateur, entrepreneur, chef in Portugal and in Lisbon in particular. So you go there and you have a sample, and it's quite affordable, but like they will do 3 or 4 dishes that they do in their restaurants, at an affordable price. You pick them up, then you go sit in the middle. Capacity of 1,000 people maybe. And I was brought there by friends from Lisbon. And it's just packed with people from Lisbon, from locals basically, who go there all the time, and tourists. So I thought this meeting point and it's cultural in the sense that all the recipes of the product are from Portugal, and they reinterpret them. So you can have this amazing experience, basically, of sampling, the best tradition and the best innovation in culinary, as a culinary experience. And what I think was amazing is that in a course of maybe 5 days, I was brought there 4 times by people from Lisbon who told me, we have to go there. I said, yeah, I've just been there yesterday. Oh, you don't want to go? I said, yes, let's go because I want to try this. So the question is more about what is culture? Would you, as the Asia Art Archive, would you consider this as a piece of art, meaning the culinary experience? How does it plays into what makes culture, art, and the destination?
Okay, so I think I should start by saying, these are probably more my opinions rather than Asia Art Archives. And the department I run looks after fundraising as well as patron experiences. So in that case, in the Asia Art Archive context, we look as art purely as visual art.
Yeah.
But I think, before we are our jobs, we are people. And I think, food is so important, and food is such an important part of an experience. And in fact, when we do our small group of elite patrons, we do one international trip for them every year. And food is so important. There was one year they went to Iran and they had kebabs every day, and I'm still hearing about the kebabs. But that was before my time. Last year we went to Israel, and we really put in the effort to because it's part of absorbing what the place is about, right? And being Hong Kongers, I think food is all very personally important to all of us, so that's quite crucial. But in terms of, can you create it? This is not on the agenda, but one place I've been looking at for a while is Singapore.
Yes.
And they've been trying really hard to try to create. They're really invested in their F&B. The government has subsidies and promotions for, their star chefs. They did Gilman Barracks. They did all of that. Yeah. And just last week, one of the people who work on arts and arts promotion, doing his his master's at SOAS at the moment, and we had a conference call. So I've been thinking about this a lot. And he's saying, well, why, I think it's really, again, an issue of, can it be built? And I think to some extent it can be, but, there's only, it depends what your goal is too, right? Like, what do you, if you plan to go from 1 to 50, sure, that's achievable, but if you go from 1 to 150, how do you achieve that? And I think that's something we all kind of struggle with. In the visual arts, with AAA, a lot of what we do is really bring histories to the surface, and we hope that and these of course manifest itself in terms of research for exhibitions, in terms of like creating infrastructure and education programs. So it's not always so direct, but from my perch, and my personal opinion is what I'm seeing is there's a lot of interesting things going on here that we're only starting to talk about. Like, you know, modernism in Hong Kong is something that we're only starting to explore. The current exhibition at M+, Canton Express, looks at the evolution of art from southern China, and we're part of that story. AA supported the research, but also, you know, when we start understanding, I think, where we're coming from, it gives us a better indication of where we're going.
Yeah, I think because the question is, at the beginning of the conversation, is really try to define, you know, what is culture, what is art, and how it's being stretched so much based there globally, and for people, you know, this could be a piece of art in a way, and the execution, the experience. You know, could recipes one day end up in a museum or things like that? And beyond that, obviously, there's forms of expression that were not considered as
well. There are
art,
many artists who work with food,
like murals or graffiti. And M+ will be a great example of that vernacular art coming into a higher level of culture, basically, and you know, the importance of that. Anybody who wants from Singapore wants to interject on the food culture? Patrick.
I just moved from Singapore, but back there.
Oh, welcome.
I think
Welcome to Hong
where
Kong.
Singapore has done a very good job, as opposed to trying to push the high end, is in keeping the food courts.
Yeah.
And that's a fantastic thing that everyone loves about food courts. That's the one that's bubbled up in the bottom. Just needed a gentle hand, as opposed to trying to impose maybe a higher goal. So I think that's where Singapore's had success.
Yeah, but I also look at, like, absolutely, I agree with you. But, you know, look at chefs like Wei Lin and even Andre, and you look at the standard at which they operate, and it's really, really amazing, and it's helped. I mean, but that's the Singapore model. That's not the Hong Kong model, and you cannot import the Singapore model to Hong Kong as well. I mean, it's very, again, specific.
No, every destination is specific. But you mentioned N+, Christian, just to maybe have a from West Kowloon. I think the idea of M+ really looking at design and neon signs and things like that as a piece of art. And I think that's for me, that's also the food culture could be one day in a form or another integrated into the whole high culture experience. Right?
Well, sure.
I have to say, I'm on this sort of commercial side rather than the
Yeah.
side of it. I mean, it's interesting that you make references to the food, because I think the food experience is such an integral part of that. And sometimes in the design, actually, I think, you know, people always see the restaurants as sort of getting in the way of all the, you know, when you're trying to look at the operations of museums or cultural venues, then people almost don't want to see the restaurants. They think, you know, we're irritating, and yet actually, you know, what we're hearing just now is that, you know, combining those two elements is so important. Hopefully we'll try and achieve that with it.
Yeah, because we're trying to find out, you know, the success drivers, and I think it's becoming a key success driver.
Let's brainstorm a bit.
Well, no, it's
What Timothy will do.
I love that remark that you made about, you know, 4 different people in Lisbon taking you to the same place. You know, that's
local people.
Yeah, a tremendous sense of ownership of this and great pride.
Yes.
You know, that's a lovely story. But actually, this is an interesting thing about the kind of the co-location of arts and, you know, food destinations is an interesting thing, because with a number of arts organisations, performing arts companies that I've worked with over the last few years, there's been a lot of audience research done, trying to understand what motivates people to attend. And of course, there are many different reasons, but there's a company called Morris Hargrave McIntyre. It's a UK-based audience research, market research, but they have a particular focus on researching the behaviour of audiences for cultural events. And they have identified, you know, generally 8 kinds of behaviours that drive people to attend cultural events. And there's a very significant audience, or potential audience, which wants to, of course, attend a cultural performance or exhibition, but have the opportunity to interact with similar-minded people in a social context. And so there's, you know, somehow there's an opportunity for us to be conceiving this entire experience where not only do you come to see an exhibition or experience a performance, but you are somehow given this opportunity to meet and mingle with people who share a similar kind of interest and want to have the opportunity to sit down afterwards and have a chat about it, or maybe even meet one of the performers or one of the creative people involved.
So sharing.
I think there's a chance to kind of conceive this whole thing in a single offering to the public.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. This place of sharing.
Yeah.
And the need of in our time, of course.
Yeah.
Things, if you don't share them, don't exist basically.
Yeah. So in a way, the restaurant or cafe or bar experience that is adjacent to the cultural experience needs to play quite an integrated role in that. And of course, with the project that I'm working on at the Central Police Station, it's an incredibly exciting opportunity where you actually, as an organisation, not only do you have the relationships with the creative organisations, the arts organisations, the presenters of exhibitions and festivals, but you also have commercial relationships with restaurant operators and the chance to somehow bring together these two normally quite separate things into some synergy which will create these opportunities. I think it's a very exciting prospect.
Perfect transition to our next question.
Can I just
go.
pick up on
Sorry.
one point? I mean,
Yeah.
at CPS, on the gallery building, we made the decision long before Tim came on board to put a restaurant in the middle of it. And that a lot of people think that was the wrong thing to do, and that other people are very strongly it was the right thing to do. And I think it will come back to the fact of how it operates and how its relationship develops. And I think it'll be a function of the people who come and spend the time there and spend the money there as much as anything else.
Yeah.
And this is a great concept, and in fact we have a fantastic opportunity in Central Market to do something like this.
Amen.
That's a personal
Absolutely.
Actually, I have a question. With CPS, what was the thinking in terms of the mix of commercial versus food
Maybe we get
versus
to
art?
that later.
We'll come to
Yeah,
come to some of that
we'll get
later.
to that later. All right. Next question. So, for you, Timothy.
Yeah.
I had an office.
Wow.
Wyndham Street.
For lovely Wyndham Street?
Yeah. I think what's interesting here is the relationship. I think we were talking about between the epitome, the epic of high culture, and its relation to when you go to the circular quay, the rocks is a bit this Vegas. So from your experience, how did you? I think we know it's happening. This connection. How was it planned? I think we're really looking at the drivers and the decision making, and was it a strategy? I mean, you were there, so maybe you can talk to us about this aspect of what we're trying to see today is really what makes things happen, basically.
Well, in a way it's a challenge because the iconic nature of the building is a result of an architectural. It's a combination of an architectural concept where Jon Utzon wanted to. He was inspired by
the boats.
The Mayan temple.
Oh, okay.
So you can't see. You can't really tell from here. But when you approach the building from here, when you walk towards it, you're really confronted by this incredible set of monumental steps, which is like ascending a temple. Of course, it's a nightmare for disability compliance. The entire building is the worst disability challenge you could imagine. But the fact that it's built out on this point of land sticking out into the water means it automatically has a separation from the city. So you have to somehow work against that to try and connect it to the city. One of the best things that's happened in the last 10 years, in fact, this year maybe it was the 9th iteration of it, was a festival that was created, in fact, by the state government. Hard to believe that a government could create anything. Must have been some clever person who gave them the idea. But it's this festival called Vivid, which is a festival of lights, light, music, and ideas. And it started,
make global headlines.
yeah. It started off relatively modestly. It was really just to identify a period in the year when tourism took a bit of a dip, took a bit of a dump, and this period, which is the early winter, it's the last week of May and the first week of June. And the idea was to create this very exciting focal point which would attract national and international tourism. So it's all driven by the tourism ministry of the state government. And it's about illuminating the buildings all around Circular Quay, and every year it gets bigger and takes over more areas of the city. But the Opera House, being white, is a perfect kind of blank screen on which to project very creative images. And it's now, in its first year, it was already tremendously successful, and it kind of doubled in size in terms of the audience that it attracted every year. And now it's actually reached the point where it's becoming a kind of crowd control challenge for the police, because it runs for 2 weeks, and it attracts vast numbers of people into this whole precinct. But the focus is on the Opera House. Now, the Opera House, it's a great opportunity to have people there, but it then comes back to this challenge. They're all on the outside. So we cleared the venue of all of the regular resident companies like the Sydney Symphony, Opera Australia, the Australian Ballet, the Sydney Theatre. They're all out for this period of 2 weeks, and the Opera House would take over and curate a program which was really relevant to that style of audience and to try to get as many people coming in as possible.
So it's the listening ingredient, right? So it was a combination of opportunity and also strategy from the city. Was it at the city level?
It was at a state level.
At the state
there are
level?
3 tiers of government: there's federal, state, and city.
Right. Yeah. I think we want to take this time to have a kind of counterexample of things that can potentially go wrong. And I think the Dallas Art District had a bad rap on this project, this master plan that was kind of isolated from the life of the city, with a lot of very high-end, high culture museum, opera, performing venues. And I don't know if anybody's familiar with this situation, but basically this is an addition to the city that was planned with all those this ensemble of building, and people would go to some of the show but would not spend time at all in the district. As you can see, it's pretty not super inviting to walk around. Patrick, do you know? You've been, yeah.
I'm used to it.
You're from Houston.
You don't Dallas.
So I think that's an interesting counterexample, because there was a disconnect between the intention of bringing culture and the life of the city. So people would just go for a show but would never hang out there. They tried to bring restaurants and operators, and it died because there was a disconnect. And also the way it was funded was with private donors in Texas or in Monet. They wanted the name on each building. And it kind of failed to attract a life in the district, in the destination, in the neighborhood. And they tried everything, festivals, things like that, which were successful when it happened, and that's just a bubble. And I think they just announced in January this year that they're looking at a completely remastering of the situation, with taking in consideration all this ingredient we're talking about, like really bringing local culture, local food, entrepreneurs, and creating a destination that I think the local community can where the local community can have ownership. I think so.
Well, you were saying that when the original call for proponents for West Kowloon came out back in 2004 or something, there was this sort of rogue bid from Swire which decentralised.
Yeah, that was the one which I think Keith Curran brought in Architectonica and Frank Gehry to come up with the alternative plan of actually distributing the cultural facilities around the harbour and using ferries as the connectivity. And I think they did an exhibition of it in Pacific Place, which was, pretty impressive.
I think the question is really, and it's the master planning and the versus organic, and how does it play, and what was your experience? I think in Sydney, and I think for Michael also, I think on your experience of development. And I think
Going way back into the 1990s, when I was still with Swire Properties, we were developing the beginning of the development of what's now going to be a massive commercial development complex at Taikoo Place, Taikoo Shing. I think they're going to have something like 9 million square feet of offices when it's finished. It's a decentralized CBD, basically.
Yep.
And there was a willingness in the Swire shareholders to put some money into development of cultural facilities in parallel with that. And we tried to persuade the government to give us a piece of land just at the Cross Harbour Tunnel there, on which we wanted to build a gallery of modern art. But unfortunately then, and it's still the case today, there is no government policy on the allocation of private land for cultural infrastructure, and yet we have some of the wealthiest people in the world and in Asia who would be willing to build. They could be the Guggenheims and the, you know, of the future, the people that would be willing, but there is no land policy to support it. And I remember going with Keith Kerr to see Secretary for Planning, Environment and Lands and Director of Land to say, you need a policy. There's a willingness of the private sector to do these things, but unless you can get the land, you can't do it. And so I think Hong Kong has missed an opportunity to get much more private investment into cultural facilities because of the lack of availability of land. Instead, massive amounts of money are going to go into West Kowloon. I'm not saying that's wrong, but there were people, and there still are people, who would have been willing to, through their philanthropy, fund that type of cultural infrastructure if the land could have been made available to them.
So you think there's an organic potential on a much higher level? So we're talking about organic growth more on the ground, on how to have the community participating. You say that at the state or at the city level, like Hong Kong, it could also happen.
When you look at a city like London, the theatres are all privately owned. They're not in public ownership. You know, the culture of London is largely in a substantial portion of it's in private hands, not public hands.
Can you talk a bit about Edinburgh? Edinburgh,
I think Edinburgh, most of the cultural infrastructure is government owned, but I think it's well supported by the business community and by a lot of the funding of the content comes from philanthropy and sponsorship and membership, and they do raise a lot of private finance, but the assets tend to be owned by largely government.
I have a comment, actually.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that excites me most about Hong Kong is that what we have in terms of culture and the institutions we have are predominantly because of private initiative, be it either conglomerates or individuals or many of them small scale. I cannot think of a single organization that gets more than 20% of funding from the government.
Really?
Oh, wonderful. Sorry, in the visual arts.
In the visual arts.
Yeah.
The performing arts is completely different.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so, like, even places like Serpentine or National Gallery, they're more than 30, 40, 50% government subsidy. So, again, just to quickly go back to again, my comparison of Singapore, a lot of what they have is, they have a National Gallery, which is beautiful and which is built and existing. A lot of that is really government driven, but what excites me, it's a challenge because in Singapore, for every dollar you give, you get $3 in tax credits. In Hong Kong, like my personal experience, it's really, really difficult to raise support here, and because there's no incentive, right? But despite that, I think the private sector has come up and said we'll do what we can, and I think it's really just waiting for things like land policy and things like institutions that they can get behind.
I also think that it's, particularly in the performing arts, and I think to some extent in visual arts in Hong Kong, there's been such a long history of government support that there was a perception, when I used to be with the Hong Kong Philharmonic Orchestra, there was very much a perception, you guys are fine, you get your money from the government, why should we, a private individual, contribute? It takes quite a long time to develop that sense of, relying on philanthropy to take it to the next level.
To another level.
I think that's, I do think that's evolving. In this town, it's an incredible opportunity. It's still very much in its infancy. It's quite an exciting opportunity, but it does take a long time to first of all change that mindset, and then develop the relationships that will eventually turn into the kind of private support that you want. And I think that, again, coming back to this idea of really successful and authentic and genuine arts destinations being organic, something that makes them organic is that sense of the community really owning the arts companies and owning the work of the artists, and somehow having the opportunity to participate. And so there's this American model which is virtually no government funding, and
this is all private donors.
Yeah, all private donors.
Right.
And then,
it's Texas.
And then some potential influence from private. The ideal situation is to have a kind of firewall between the source of the funding and the artistic integrity. When you're entirely reliant on private sector funding, it's hard to resist the influence. On the other hand, you go to places like certain countries in Central Europe where there's an enormous reliance still
On state.
almost exclusively on state funding, and no
France.
no sort of sponsorship or philanthropy. I don't think that's healthy. I think we've got an opportunity to really get those things in a good balance, where there's a blend of government support that provides stability and philanthropy which provides community ownership. Not philanthropy at the tens of millions of dollars level, but at a small personal level where people think, I really love what you guys are doing,
Ownership,
and I want to
yeah.
give $5,000 a year.
That's very interesting, and I think I think in this case it started maybe as a hardcore private ownership, and I think the success is only coming when the community feels the grassroots community feels more involved. And but you're right. You have example. I mean, I guess in Los Angeles with the Walt Disney Frank Gehry auditorium, it's also it's very much a private led organization.
There was actually a very nice thing that the Art Gallery of New South Wales did in Sydney about 10 years ago, when or more than 10 years ago, they wanted to buy a Cézanne for the collection, and it needed to be supported through philanthropy. And of course, with any major capital campaign like that, before you go public, you make sure that you've got about 50% of the funds already committed. But when they went public, they gave every individual had the opportunity to contribute $100, and they sold it you could own that brush. It was a really cute idea. So people go, oh yeah, I bought that.
Yeah. I mean, it is a chance. Like at AA, we just actually started an adopt a book program where for 500 Hong Kong dollars, you can adopt a book in the library. But it's making that connection with people, because I think, again, for the visual arts, there is this sense that this is for them, this has nothing to do with me, and there's still so much work to be done in terms of getting people excited and getting people to feel like they are part of this and this is for them. Because again, like with any organization, most of your funding comes from, a set number of people.
Right.
And because we're all small organizations, you end up servicing just that group, but then there's everyone else. And like you say, this idea of making people feel like they're invested in it, even if like $500, a lot of our books are more than $500, but that idea that that this is for you, that you're part of this, is very important, and it's almost like citizenship, I think. How do we promote that?
I mean, ironically, in Edinburgh, as an example, we built a new museum of Scotland about 15 years ago, and there's a Lady Ivy Wu gallery funded by the Gordon Wu and his family.
Yeah.
And you kind of think, well, what were their connections to Scotland? But They put up a pretty substantial proportion of the cost of that building and got recognition for it. But would they have the opportunity to do that in Hong Kong? They do in university buildings, of course. You only have to walk through any of the universities
Yes.
and you can see the scale of philanthropy here, and it's massive. But again, for the reasons of finding opportunities, it's never found its way into the arts sector.
It's
Or not to any
But
large
again,
extent.
that's the challenge. How do we, because I think what also happens, and I find, this is a personal opinion from in the visual arts, is we have some really good curators and good artists, but some of the curators end up curating for the only five people who care about this stuff. And their job is to put together the best show that they can, not necessarily to engage people. But I think we're at a different point in life in Hong Kong where we have to start thinking about how do we create new audiences, how do we excite people, how do we make people feel like quality, this is quality entertainment that is not school. So
yeah. I think what you just talked about made me think of also technology and crowdfunding and things like that. Do you think, because what you described, buy a stroke, that's a model that potentially could benefit from those new internet technology, and crowdfunding and things like that?
I don't think so.
You don't think so?
I think it's about relationships,
Right.
and I think that the crowdsourcing is a bit removed. But for it to be long-lasting and sustainable, it's about relationships. So it means people like Alex have to put in enormous amounts of time to maintain those relationships with this huge list of people, from the biggest donors to the smallest. But it's an incredibly important thing, and you have to be genuine about this group of people who support you. You actually have to let them in a bit more than the public, and you have to create those opportunities for them to get a closer access to the kind of the beating creative heart of your organisation.
It's back to the idea of a meeting place and
where
you can share.
The whole organisation has to buy into it. You need. I had the great privilege of being the general manager of the Australian Chamber Orchestra, which totally buys into, where every member of the orchestra actually has personal relationships with all of the donors. And they all attend the post-performance receptions, and they go and speak to, and they're coached to do it. But actually, they don't resent doing it. It becomes just a natural part of their working lives, that they spend the time investing in those relationships. And that organisation is on such incredibly solid ground when it comes to its private funding.
Interesting.
That's very interesting.
Yeah. Okay, moving on. We are at this point of the conversation. I want to start getting back closer to home, Asia, with some example, and of course, I think Seoul has been a very interesting model in terms of beyond culture, but how do you motivate people to take ownership of a city and bring also attention from the tourist perspective? And what's been, I think, interesting in Seoul is those projects such as the river that was really just a drain. It's like pretty, and that's a wonderful, that becoming a wonderful piece of urban architecture that brings people together and then flow organically into other parts. I mean, there's a museum next to it. There's cultural high points, and this the very new latest highway, which is like this suspended garden with I think 24,000 trees on it. It's 1 kilometer long. It's really following up in the path of the New York High Line. So maybe Michael, because those are structural projects in a way that bring an organic platform in a sense, and I think with Swire definitely there's that in a way you create you curate a neighborhood and then you let it somehow. My question, I guess, is can you curate organic growth from a structured platform, basically?
I think the science is called biophilia. It's about making you feel good, and it goes back to, you know, man evolving from the savannas, and the shelter came from the trees, and there are some very fundamental human behaviors which you can create in a modern environment. And I think if you look at some of the work that Swire's done in the Taikoo Place in that area, where we had to, you know, we had to fight our way sometimes to get streets diverted, to plant trees. If you ever want to, Hong Kong Land spend a lot of money planting trees, but boy, if you ever ask Jim Robinson about how many years it took them to fight the campaign to get to plant those trees.
We worked on those projects.
From a design, construction and implementation point of view, it's not difficult to create environments like that.
But the
very
city
often
has to be, I mean,
the obstacle
in both
becomes
cases,
the
the city is the
political
driver,
one.
right?
You know, Paul Zimmerman and I often have discussions on this subject because, as I keep saying to Paul, when he comes to me and tells me we should be doing more around Central Police Station, I said, well, that's surely what the District Council should be doing, isn't it? You know, we'll help, and we're happy to help implement things, but. And it's back to the point about, I think, listening. You know, local communities generally have a very good idea of what they'd like. But the people who have the funding and the control over the money don't necessarily listen to them about what they do. But, and I think there is tremendous opportunity to... Hong Kong today needs to be more walkable. I think everyone would probably agree with that. We allocate far too much street space to cars and far too little to people. And you've only got to walk around Soho and Wyndham Street, and on a hot day in busy summer when all the cars are queuing up to go and pick somebody up. And it shouldn't be like that. But the challenge is, how do you change it? From a physical infrastructure point of view, it's not difficult because you can do things like
those are very ingenious. It doesn't even take on the traffic basically, which is great.
So there's it's the will and the desire and the...
How do you create the same relationship you create for the donors and the community? Any experience on that to create a relationship where the politicians are aware of the decision maker of the city can be more involved in the project, so to allow for
drinking?
One of the more interesting challenges we've had, of the many challenges at Central Police Station, is building the bridge to link to the escalator.
Oh yeah.
Now, we had reservations about whether this was a good thing to do or not. You could argue it both ways. It's good to have, but you could also argue it's not good to have because it does interrupt the views. However, there was a very strong view within government that it must be built. And therefore it became a planning condition, so we have to build it. So the choice was taken out of our hands. And it will be a good thing, but boy, has it had a few challenges along the way. And that's just one small example of the difficulty of making the type of infrastructure improvement from which the city would benefit enormously. It is difficult. And you know, people often say Hong Kong needs a mayor. It needs somebody who's going to actually look at the fabric of the city and drive the engineering ability, the architectural ability, the design. It's all there. It's the political will that's missing.
So Hong Kong has no mayor.
There's
never thought of that, of it like that.
In Sydney, how does it work? Because they trying to link the opera underground with the other side, correct?
Link it with,
they try to link the opera grounds under the streets to the commercial venues that are at the back. Is this a private initiative or it's a...
No, that was all... well, actually, can you go back to that?
That's Renzo Piano.
To my office. There's this quite famous woman called Kate Blanchett, who was, until recently, she was the artistic director of the Sydney Theatre Company. And she introduced this idea of what she called a cultural ribbon, which is a linkage between the Opera House and then some of the cultural venues around here, right around here, and then most interesting around here.
Right.
This is an area called Walsh Bay,
Yeah.
and so it's on the western
On
side
the other
of
side.
the bridge.
Yeah.
You can walk there from here to there is about a 20-minute walk, and it's a series of old wharves. They were built in 1915 for the export of wool, mostly for exporting wool. There are 4 or 5 of them. They're enormously long. They're like almost 800 meters long, I think. They're incredible, not that long. And in the 1980s, they were by the 1980s, they were completely unused and they were empty and kind of rotting. And the government of the day decided to convert one into a hotel and one into a home for the Sydney Theatre Company. So it has a number of rehearsal studios and 2 small theatres and a restaurant at the end. And it was always a bit, you know, if you ask the majority of people who live in Sydney, oh, have you been to Walsh Bay? They still don't know where it is. It amazes me. It's now about to be turned in. It was a kind of half-finished cultural precinct project, and the current government has decided to actually make the rest of it happen. And so it never really had enough elements to make it a proper...
You need the mass, the gravity.
Yeah, the critical mass, exactly. Yeah. So actually there's, in the last few years, there's been a new theatre built around there, and now one of the other wharves is being converted into a home for my old company, the Australian Chamber Orchestra, for another theatre company, the Bell Shakespeare Company, and for a company called Australian Theatre for Young People. And it means that by the time this precinct is finished in 2019 or 20 or 21 or 22, depending on what happens, but you know, it should be finished around 2019-20. That precinct will be the home of the Sydney Theatre Company, Sydney Dance Company, Bangara, the Indigenous Dance Company, the Australian Chamber Orchestra, Sydney Philharmonia Choir, Australian Theatre for Young People, and the Bell Shakespeare Company. And now that is critical mass. And there'll be enough activity happening. In order for all of those companies to qualify to be given space there, they have to show what their public programs were, to bring people throughout the day, overnight, over in the evenings, over weekends, 365 days a year.
Right.
That was the selection criteria was not can you pay the rent, can you make a contribution to the life of the precinct.
I see.
Is that where the W used to be? No.
No, that's around.
Other side.
Woolloomooloo.
No.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, great. I think...
Sorry.
our speaker from last salon just arrived. I think my question on how do you create that bond or that awareness with the government lead us to our next question. I think it's kind of opening up on the meaning and the strength, the value that a government, a country can place into culture, its culture and culture in general. And so I'll go back to Korea, which I think it's as since the 90s or 80s, I think, has been there's been this concerted effort, not effort, but investment from the government into developing culture, in popular culture in terms of Korea, as soft power. And we've seen the resonance, the effect of it in Asia, certainly, Korean pop culture being music, TV series, art, film, fashion, dominating countries that were once imposing their culture standard on this small country that is South Korea, Japan, China. So I think, is that an argument that a city like Hong Kong would be ready to hear that, you know, developing further its own in its own culture is soft power, basically. And I think for those who don't know that gentleman, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Hilary. Yeah. Yeah. So that, yeah, Tito, right? So I think maybe you know, of course, that guy is from the biggest music band called Big Bang in Korea. And what's amazing is he's an art collector, very young. I think last year, right, Livina, is in Sotheby's, right? He curated a collection that was auctioned, and it made headline globally, of course, but it brings also a younger crowd, I think, to the idea of collecting art, things like that. Do you want to talk about that?
There was a lot of people. I mean, I actually was one of the highly attended Sotheby's auction previews. He appeared for 5 minutes, but there were, I think at least 400 to 500 young teenagers that were following K-pop, following his fame, going to, for the first time to see a Sotheby's auction. And it was very, auction.
Power of celebrity.
Yeah, but it doesn't. It comes at that wave that was created by the government is political.
Yeah.
It's like, how do we, as a small country, can exist culturally, and that will, if our culture, expand into other countries, then easier to sell our product also, and things like that. I think it's all concept. It's a strategy.
Yeah, and I think that there's a plan actually from the Korean government to open a cultural center here to further promote the Korean arts and film and entertainment and visual arts and performing arts in Hong Kong. So it's quite a strong push.
Well, their consulate here is extremely active on the cultural front.
Very
So they have, films, they do everything else. But I think that goes back to the root. I mean, that's something I think that can happen in Korea because one of the, in the experience of film, for a long time there were quotas, right? So if you were a cinema operator, X percent, very large percent of of the films that you were screening had to be Korean. They removed that very recently, so it was supported artificially in that sense. I mean, was it good? Was it bad? It helped, but I don't know. That's not something that I think would work in Hong Kong. If you suddenly say, 80% must be Hong. We don't even have that many. Like Hong.
But there was
Yeah,
a time
so-
where Hong Kong movies was the golden standard of Asian cinema.
Yeah, but the world changed.
I'm old enough to have been. I'm old enough to have been a teenager in Britain in the 1960s, and we had Carnaby Street, we had the Kinks, we had rock and roll, we had the Beatles, we had the Stones, we had the Mini. We had that wave of popular culture, which meant it was a great time to be a teenager. But I guess that's what Korea is going through just now. Why does that happen? How does it happen? Is it led by government? It's very hard to know, but these things do happen.
Yeah,
It's
they do.
probably a combination of many circumstances. I don't think you can create it, is probably the answer. I think
You
it
can
just-
package it when it happens,
happens.
like Cool Britannia, right? Like that was packaged, that
well,
wasn't
of
manufactured.
Brit
so-
art, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've read
I have a very simple
quite a lot about Brit art.
question. Isn't it also very linked to the political context? Because usually when we are talking about youth and young people, they are driven somehow indirectly by the espoir,
The hope.
Yeah.
their hope for the future, or
Yes,
how do they
yes.
want things to change in which way? So maybe in Hong Kong, I have no idea about.
You are very new to Hong
I'm
Kong.
really new, but at the same time, I'm looking at what the different examples and hearing what you are saying, and at the same time, I can't help but think about the political context and the future in that sense. Is this linked to the possibilities, to
Does it allow it to develop? Does it allow it to flourish? Yeah, I think it's a very good point. If you look at Britain today, there seems that we're going to go through a major political shift which may lead to a generation which will flourish instead of being kind of disinterested in life, will be more engaged in life and will make a difference. Yeah, I think it does make a big difference. And that's possibly what drove Britain in the 1960s.
Right.
Yeah, I think Berlin is a really good example. I grew up in West Berlin,
Oh yeah.
and when it comes to young people and artists kind of finding space, you need to, the city provides space, and this kind of open space and the freedom is the base for that to happen. If you don't have that,
No question about it. I mean, it's you think about Brooklyn, Berlin. That's where artists are going to thrive, and it's not Upper East, New York. I mean, once they succeed, they go over.
The question is, how can the destination contribute to that? Because let's focus it back to why we're
Right.
here. So how can a cultural destination help with giving this freedom?
I think in Sydney, I guess with your example, they open up some of those structure to companies, to artists, to studio.
Yeah, although
I think
it's very much about the companies. I think really what you're saying is that the individual creativity needs to be allowed to flourish, and how do you do that? Do you do that by? I mean, I think the great currency of Hong Kong that everybody needs to get a piece of is space, and providing space for artists to do creative work. I think it's probably the best way that a cultural destination can really contribute, and that's really what I meant earlier when I was saying that to me the essential element for a successful cultural precinct or destination is being a home to creativity. So being able to understand what do those artists need in terms of space. Do they need residential space? Do they need co-working space where they can bounce ideas of people working in similar or different disciplines? I think these are exciting opportunities to be explored if you have the luxury of space. So
that's again a great transition. I think maybe our last question before we open. I think it's been interactive, but since we have you guys here, what to you and Michael? So for disclosure, I think we have to say that we've been working on the Central Police Station project, Kwun, for the past 5 years. Or first, yes. So it's been a marathon, and everybody's we're looking forward to the opening as already. But I think we've seen, and Marc has been really involved in the project also. We talked at length about all those ingredients, and what it's really hard to get the right mix and what can go wrong, what is right, as you say, wrong, right. It's such a hard judgment call, right? So maybe talk a little bit about this process of looking at what shouldn't be done, and where at least where do we want to go?
My first involvement in the project was in 2009, and I was working as a freelance consultant, had some clients in Hong Kong, and I got a call from somebody saying, would you like to meet the Jockey Club chief executive? We have a problem. Because those of you who've been around for a while will remember that the club tower had put into the public domain a tall building, which, to say the least, wasn't universally admired, even though it was quite an exciting concept. And at that point, they really were uncertain as to if that was wrong, they didn't know what was right. So how do you work out what's right? And the first impression I had when I came on board the project was it didn't have a very clear purpose. It was right in that the idea of creating a cultural destination was the right thing to do, but you could define that in many ways and many different uses. So in 2009, I think it was, we engaged Asia Art Archive, because one of the things which had come out of the public consultation was there was strong support for contemporary art as a primary use. And actually, contemporary art and old buildings go quite well together. So the document's still available on the Daegun website. It's still relevant today. And one of the interesting things we asked them to do was find some comparable projects. And one of them was the Vienna Quarter in Vienna, and there was another one in Birmingham, I think, the chocolate factory, I think. But actually, neither of them were comparable, really, when you looked in more detail.
It's hard to find a model.
Correct. So we had the situation where we had 16 heritage buildings, which were monuments, which is the highest status that the government accords to heritage buildings here. And we had a desire to have a centre primarily for contemporary art, but with other uses. So our board knew that we could conserve the buildings, but the revitalisation had to require new facilities, particularly if art was going to be the primary use. The question was how much, how big, and what scale, and it was actually the scheme which we're building today was developed working with Rocco. I worked with Rocco personally because Rocco understood Hong Kong. He understood the way the planning system works. Now, that's not a disrespect to Herzog de Meuron and what they did. They were asked to do something like that. They didn't just do it by chance. They were asked to do something exciting. But eventually we came up with the scheme that we're now building, and with which Herzog de Meuron are the lead architect, and they're also responsible for all the modern interventions. We also have Rocco as our executive
Yeah.
architect and Purcell as our heritage architect. And it's been an interesting how you deal with the tensions amongst three architects and the resolution of the many, many problems that we've had to confront where heritage buildings don't fit building regulations, things like that.
Yeah.
And it has taken a long time, but our board, at the very beginning, the board made it very clear that they wanted us to use international best practice approach to heritage conservation, with Purcell as our guiding light on that. And again, we published the conservation management plan, which set out the parameters right at the beginning, so that's largely what we followed. And equally with the modern buildings, it was to create cultural facilities of a world-class standard that, you know, everybody would be proud of. It's cost us a lot more than we thought, but every time I've gone to the board to explain why, they've always agreed that yes, we need to spend the money because they've stayed with the vision. Now, very often projects go wrong because that doesn't happen. So I've got to hand it to the Jockey Club stewards, and there's been quite a number of changes over the time scale, but they have always backed the project and backed because they never diverted from that desire. The question then came up of what to do with it and how to operate it, and because it was something that was beyond our contemplation, we worked with a consultant team and prepared an operating plan. But how you take that plan and implement it there is a lot of flexibility. And Tim's predecessor, Ewan Upston, who some of you have probably met, who was also from Sydney and had been the Chief Operating Officer of the MCA. Working with Ewan, we went through an exercise to really try and identify what's possible on this site, because it's a very diverse set of buildings. There's a number of outdoor spaces, there's indoor space, which can have a whole variety of uses. And with Tim on board now, he's now picking up the work that was done in the past, and his job is to turn this into reality. And as I said earlier on, I'm satisfied that we have a physical infrastructure which will be attractive place to be. We want to make it very open, we want to make it very inclusive, but ultimately success will depend on the content. Yeah. So with that, I'll hand to Tim about how he's going to approach the content.
Thanks, Mark. Well, I think by listening would be a good start. But I think to take the example of how to bring the creativity into the site, there's a provision in the plan for certain areas to be artists' studios. Yeah, so artists. There's a plan for artists in residence, and really we're at the stage now where we have to really articulate what that means, and how do we select people, and what sort of process would we go through to select exactly the right kind of creative individuals, because it'll obviously need to go. It'll need to be a pretty open process because it's a very public kind of organisation. But we've got to get the mix right, and we have to really decide what do we want to have there, what kind of people will really contribute to the character of this amazing site. Do we want to have a filmmaker there who we could support for a year to write a film and that is actually made on site, or what kind of creative people do we want to have there? What is our definition of creative artist? So it's really important for us to articulate that now, so that we really know when we go out and look for those people, we've got a very clear sense of what we expect them to. Obviously, it has to be a meaningful and worthwhile opportunity for those individuals, but it needs to somehow add to the success of the site. And how do we want them to be involved in everything else that we're doing, and what's the most meaningful way of making the most out of their presence in the area. So that's a very interesting philosophical thing for us to consider. We don't have any really clear expectations on how we will go and find those people. So it's a nice blank sheet to start with, but it needs to start with very much understanding what what Hong Kong creative people are looking for, and what can we provide to meet that need. And so that's really the exercise that we have to do first, to before we start going to be too specific.
I think we can. I mean, it's been a pretty interactive session already, but I think if it's time for any questions, you're welcome to ask. Yeah.
For the education, I'm from South Korea myself, and I work for Alex in the I have a question about gentrification. Alex mentioned about how in order to create a cultural destination, it is important that we listen to the public and to engage in the local communication of the artists. And what I've witnessed within Korea is that people are very responsive to the trends, and people follow everywhere that is very, very hip. That people go to places that where artists are booming, and oftentimes the aftermath of that phenomenon is gentrification, where the artists are themselves who are taken out of their region where they practice their art. So my question is, what is the role of governments or the management parts to ensure those artists for their practice of art, I guess for their safe practice of art, to ensure the local culture never diminishes? What do you think the role of the government or the management to keep that fine?
I didn't plant that, so.
That's a tricky one. I mean, my involvement with the club in arts and culture has been predominantly through the CPS project, but I do know that as an organisation, the amount of funding that the club is allocating to support Hong Kong culture has been increasing every year. And so things like the Tai Hang Fire Dragon is now a Jockey Club funded event. So I know that it's back to the point that I think Tim made earlier on about the need to listen to what do people actually want, and then somehow find a way of ensuring that these important cultural history, to find a way of ensuring that that they are maintained and they do develop. And certainly my kind of narrow answer to your question is that the Jockey Club Charities Trust is definitely trying to do that through its financial support. But I think, as we mentioned earlier on, property in Hong Kong is a headache for everybody because of the lack of availability and the cost. That is a challenge.
But I think Berlin example is interesting in that sense. I mean, gentrification, you cannot fight gentrification apparently. If you go all around the world, you know, so you can maybe create pockets of protection.
It's interesting to look at, New York since the Second World War.
Right.
And where, if there would, I reckon there would be a very clear map of, first of all, artists inhabiting certain kind of cheap real estate in rundown areas and creating these communities that then gradually, and I think that that'd be a really interesting map to have a look at to see how that happens. I don't have any direct answer to your question, but I think it's a fascinating subject.
I think that's the answer in a way that there will always be this movement, and it's nothing we can really fight, but we can always look for the next space for the art to go.
Yeah, it's a game of.
It's a game in a way, yeah. And I think as long as we live in a kind of predominantly capitalist system, that's how the game works. But there is a really market-driven, let's say that. But there's a very interesting. New York's a very interesting example where now it goes out of the city. It goes up the Hudson into the rural areas. So, which
is quite nice too. Beacon,
so maybe
Beacon project,
my point of view, maybe if you see where the artists go, buy property next.
Well, you look at Wong Chuk Hang now that it's got a railway, it's gone through the massive transformation.
But that's art galleries, right? So what
Photon
about
still.
No,
Do you
yeah,
see-
but I think it's also informed like the kind of arts that have come out of Hong Kong. So we don't have a lot of people who do amazing large sculpture
Sure.
because where are you going to fabricate, right? But we have some really, really amazing conceptual artists because you don't need that
Right.
much space, right?
Right.
So it's
Like
and
in
you look at-
Beijing, you've got all the space you want for
Yeah.
the artist.
and
Yeah.
you know, even film, you look at how that's kind of evolved. I think though, I think the best thing the government can do is stay out of it. Honestly, like support where you can, like fix your land policy.
allocation or
I mean, one of the reasons why the Jockey Club is such a great funder is they really leave you alone.
Mm.
They don't tell you what to do. Well, maybe you, for us. But not you, you're special.
You must know how to navigate through the donations process.
You can buy
Francis.
me, you can buy me lunch.
First of all, I'm sorry I was late to be here. We asked the wrong question, but since I was late, I would like to be more than usual, a little bit contradictory.
Please.
I think wherever you are in the world, you cannot analyze a situation or a fact if you do not understand the history. So first of all, for many, many years, Hong Kong was China. And everything which was China in art, in everything, movies, went to China. So we need to recover something else. I think the best thing we have for the time being is all the art exhibitions. Hong Kong is a place for art exhibition. I'm not sure we have artists, maybe there's some here and will be killed at the end. I think Hong Kong has not yet found what he's good with, what we can do. We are still looking for something for Hong Kong. Thanks to the Jockey Club, we have not the decision, but the money to do things. But it's still very much controlled, but you cannot compare. Hong Kong is not a country. You know what happened in Korea is because it's exactly like the Movida in Spain. When suddenly Spain opened, you had a lot of artists, movie makers, a lot of things. And Korea was for a long time closed. Even South Korea was.
Of course.
I remember going to Korea in the 80s. There was one bridge to cross the river. So you cannot forget about the past of the country. And Hong Kong needs to find this new way. We have not yet completely found it. Now I hope that your project will not be only a commercial project, and we need some art and creativity.
Oh, it won't.
I think but you've touched on a very important point, and in fact, in the early stage of the project, the part that we totally underestimated was the heritage interpretation,
Right.
the storytelling. And I think you know the background to this. We engaged, we hired a lovely lady called Winnie Young who had done the Tai-Ho Heritage Hotel, had worked with the Sino Foundation. And when you go to this site, when it opens, one thing that will strike you more than anything else, it tells you the history of law, order, crime and punishment in Hong Kong, but the good and the bad. So your point's very well made. That, you know, it's very important when people go to this site that they understand what it was and what part it played in the period from 1850 through to 2006 when it was finally decommissioned as a police centre.
I think people might be. First of all, the site is, just walking through it it's pretty amazing experience. I think people would be just in awe because for the people who've been there before, it's really a transformation. You didn't see the site before when it was open and functioning as a public service.
It was not that open, actually.
Part of it were. I've been there to report
Unless
some
you were
losing a wallet or something as a police station. So. But I think what people would be amazed at also, I hope so, is that the cultural the historical layer, and that we excavate from the site and in the shape of telling the story of what happened pretty bluntly in all this collection of buildings throughout time from the end of the 19th century to today, and that's bringing certainly a layer of hopefully ownership or at least understanding where it's coming from, and then having the function, a pocket maybe for some artists to reinterpret something here.
But I think Mr. Gutan makes a really good point about knowing your history. One of the problems with Hong Kong art is people say nothing happened, right, in the 60s and 70s. And that's not true. People were just not invited, so they didn't know. I mean, a lot of what was interesting in art was it was very kind of literati tradition. So you have really, some of the world's greatest antiques collectors were in Hong Kong, right? But you know what? The Minchu Society, it's 30 men, no women. And no one is over, like, you know, it's of a certain age and stuff like that. But that's the tradition. How do we expand that and move that forward? Which is why I think, like at AAA, you know, people say, oh, there's nothing to do in Hong Kong. There's museums, but there's a lot going on. There's interesting nonprofit art spaces. We've started doing kind of field trips, education field trips to Guangzhou and Shenzhen because there's a lot going on there. I've seen really strong contemporary art collections in Shenzhen.
That was yesterday. It's
right?
Crazy, yeah.
But, you know, and once high-speed railway, love it or hate it, you know what? It's 45 minutes from like West Kowloon to Guangzhou, which is now a 2.5 hour trip. So when we go to Shenzhen, we use the Kowloon Bay border, and it's like going to McDonald's, right? Because you don't even have to step down from the car; you just hand your passport. It's 45 minutes. Yeah. That's amazing. That's like Wan Chai to Central today through Wan Chai, right? But I mean, and I think
it's a great
Hong
ride,
Kong, you know, it's the 20th year of the handover. I mean, I think once people make peace with what this means and what our part in this Pearl River Delta is, it's then a larger story. So that's one proposition. That's the only proposition. But I think for visual arts, there's certainly more commonality between the artists, and they're extremely exciting artists from southern China. You know, people like Big Tail Elephant, who are the stars of the M+ show. These groups and what they were doing, and that was, of course, the reason why Guangzhou had such an interesting art scene in the 1990s was because people were smuggling videotapes and cassette tapes and magazines from Hong Kong and just driving it up there. So there was more of this experimentation, right? So I think this history is very important because when you know where you came from, you know where you're going.
Yeah, identity.
Yeah.
I think M+ also will be an actor in telling part of a story. I mean, it's not just Hong Kong, Asia in general, with a design collection and things like that, which promise to be very exciting.
Is there any other questions?
Before it's time for a drink.
Let's have a drink.
Yeah, Patrick.
I think so.
Yeah.
Drift towards that when you create these kinds of zones. And I think one of the big problems in Hong Kong is not art with a capital A. We've got plenty of facilities for that. Up to and including West Kowloon. There's an awful lot of kind of high art venues.
For 6 million people.
A lot of that imported rather than people producing stuff. We said we're very good at exhibiting, but not necessarily creating.
I don't know about that.
Kind of volume. But I think if you look at the pyramid, if you like, of the art world in its totality, down here you've got art with a lowercase a, and trying to find venues for people doing stuff like that kind of entry level in Hong Kong with no tourists. I think a lot of that you probably know more about this than I do. I think a lot of that is driven by Hong Kong's particular proclivity for zoning. Abundance of workshop programs
Zoning.
around Hong Kong. All of those manufacturers
Yeah.
are now
Yeah.
they're either being used, they're either not being used at all, or they're being used often illegally for kind of whatever purposes, whether they're loft apartments or whatever they are. And if there was some way of unlocking that zone to allow for the lower end, the lower cost, that's really fundamental. If you're producing anything, as we all know, of a kind of physical creative nature,
Right.
in Hong Kong under the current zoning conditions. That's a humongously big problem.
I think it goes beyond that. Yeah, it goes beyond that. I think that we also have a tendency to institutionalize things, and I think the Quay Arts Centre, which the Jockey Club funded the capital cost, the Baptist, it never really lived up to expectations, and yet it was a fantastic idea. But somehow the institutional framework has made it a lot more sterile than it should be. And so I agree with you, there's plenty of buildings. We're not short of buildings that could be adapted for these uses.
My sense of this is we get heavily involved with things people very Hong Kong, which actually are trying to provide occasional outlets of going around other broadly speaking creative nature. It's not,
Yeah.
you couldn't always describe that as fine art, but there's an awful lot of craft happening behind the scenes. But you never see it. You never see it in Hong Kong. It's all done behind doors. And what we're trying to do is just make outlets available on a temporary weekend kind of basis for these things to emerge, and they're there.
Yeah, another example, I read recently about the number of vacant schools that the government have. Those buildings sit there, they sit there deteriorating. With a more flexible and less institutionalized approach to this, these buildings could be very easily adapted and used for the type of purposes we're talking
Flexibility is the key word.
It's the flexibility and this
because the pressure of
tendency
gentrification,
to over-institutionalize.
you can only fight
everything
with flexibility.
That's the biggest problem I see.
Spontaneity.
That's it, yeah. And that's something that we've really been trying to avoid. We're trying to, in the way we manage Central Police Station going forward, or Daegun as it will be called, is to try and make sure we're not over-institutionalized and that we do have the flexibility and that we can accommodate particularly the local artists level. Because I agree with Alex here. I think part of the problem is they don't get the opportunity to be for their work to be seen in the right places. So we have the opportunity to correct that by giving local artists a venue in which they can have their work appear. And the whole thing about that is it becomes aspirational because they're going into the same gallery that we'd have had an international show possibly before that. So they begin to realize that actually, wow, I've been in the same as Murakami or something like that, and it's that aspirational side of it it's true in art, it's true in any form of business that everybody wants to do better, but they don't often get the chance to do that. And I think that's one of the things that we do want to try and achieve.
I think I'm sorry, just to name the point about institutionalization is really important.
Yeah.
You mentioned the panel market, very interesting. Because the panel market was, I'm not wrong,
That would be
correct me
cool.
if I'm wrong, but I think that was a response to what was a completely spontaneous thing going on in Oil Street.
No, the one I mentioned was the in Quay, which was the flatted factory that's been converted into, it's operated by Baptist University. Eddie Loy used to run it, and I always remember I learned more from visiting him about what we needed to do than many others. But the cattle depot is another terrific opportunity, but it doesn't have the right model at the moment. But it's a great opportunity to do something really exciting.
All right.
The cattle depot,
Yeah, I was there on Saturday,
Yeah.
and I was surprised that there was, because there's some very interesting nonprofit art spaces there.
Yeah.
1A and Video Times, right?
Parasite are there, yeah.
No, Parasite is
They're
in
gone
North
now.
Point.
Okay.
No, Parasite was originally in Sheungwan and
Yeah.
then North Point. But I mean, despite the fact that there were no shows open, there were people there, and I think there is interest. And I'm always surprised that, with so little people, people are looking for this. So I think there's a hunger, there's a desire. So
I spent quite a bit of time with one of the local district councillors who has actually been doing a master's degree to help him with his project, was to work out what to do with the cattle depot. And it's a terrific place, which has great potential.
Yeah, and I think, they have some really wonderful spaces because they're
Yeah.
an abattoir, so the spaces are regular shaped. And one of the best programs I saw there was when they did John Cage at one of the spaces. That was so moving. It was so wonderful. But that was a pop-up. It was only 1 month. I couldn't understand why this wasn't longer. But I think just in terms of public buildings, some things that are being done right. There are many things that are not done right, but we'll not talk about that. Things that are done right are things like H houses, high houses. It just ended, and that was 6 months. That was a good chunk of time. And I thought the Lamtungpang intervention in Sha Tin was really, really wonderful. And it was, again, they left them alone. They did their thing. But then nobody went. But, then I went to the website, and there was no map. So that's another thing. It's an old house in Sha Tin. I'm like, really helpful.
On that note, I think we can continue outside with some drinks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.